When her daughter called to say, "Mom, we sold your house and your car, we needed the money," Eleanor's world shattered. But what her daughter didn't know was that the woman she thought she'd betrayed was far from powerless. If you're watching this right now, please like and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep sharing stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? I love seeing how far these stories travel and whose hearts they touch. I was sitting in the doctor's waiting room that morning, staring at a wall the color of faded mint, when my phone began to ring. The sound startled me. It had been silent for hours. I reached for it, expecting a reminder call or maybe a message from the pharmacy, but when I saw my daughter's name, Clara, flashing across the screen, I felt a small warmth in my chest. It had been days since I'd heard her voice. She was my only child, my reason for existing, the thread that had kept me steady since my husband, Thomas, passed away 6 months earlier. I answered with a smile that trembled at the edges. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Everything all right?" Her tone was cold, clipped, and strangely rehearsed. "Mom, listen, we're flying to Italy tomorrow. Martin found an opportunity. It's complicated, but it's good. Oh, and I already sold your harbor house and the car. We needed the money. I'll call when we land, okay? Take care." There was a pause so short it barely existed before the line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear as if holding it could bring her back. The hum of the waiting room grew louder, the receptionist calling names, a toddler crying, a television murmuring weather reports, but all I could hear was that one sentence echoing in my mind. "I already sold your harbor house and your car." Sold. Not borrowed, not asked, sold. That little blue house by the harbor wasn't just property, it was my entire history in wood and salt. Thomas had built the porch himself with trembling hands the summer after his retirement. Every nail, every piece of driftwood, carried a memory. And the car, the gray sedan that still smelled faintly of his cologne, had been the last thing he touched before his heart gave out over breakfast. Clara had known all of this. She had watched her father polish that car every Sunday. She had spent childhood summers at that house chasing crabs along the rocks. How could she trade all of that for money she didn't earn? I tried to call her back. The tone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. I remember placing the phone on my lap and looking around the room, wondering if anyone else could sense the world collapsing inside me. But no one noticed. The old man across from me coughed into a tissue. A nurse handed someone a clipboard. Life moved on, as it always does when your heart breaks silently. At first I wanted to cry, to scream, to beg the universe for a reason, but then something unexpected happened. A kind of stillness rose inside me, a calm so deep it frightened me. My tears dried before they could fall. Because for the first time in months since Thomas's death, since the funeral, since the endless days of loneliness, I remembered something I had completely forgotten. 3 days before he died, Thomas had come into the kitchen holding a small envelope. "Keep this somewhere safe, Ellie," he'd said softly. "If something happens to me, open it when you feel ready." I had tucked it in the dresser drawer and, in the haze of grief, forgotten it existed. Until that moment. Now, sitting on that plastic chair surrounded by coughs and fluorescent lights, I felt as if he were whispering to me again, "It's time." The nurse called my name. I stood up automatically, went through the motions, blood pressure, pulse, a kind smile from the doctor who told me I was healthy for my age. But health meant nothing when your soul felt emptied out. As I stepped back into the sunlight outside, the world seemed sharper, more deliberate. I walked slowly toward the bus stop, clutching my handbag like an anchor. I had no car now, apparently. No house, no daughter who respected me, but I did have one thing left, whatever waited inside that forgotten envelope. The bus arrived, hissing to a stop. I sat near the window and watched the town slide past the bakery Thomas loved, the florist who still waved when she saw me, the road that led down to the harbor. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. The ocean shimmered in the distance, indifferent to my loss. I thought of Clara as a little girl, her tiny hand gripping mine as we watched the tide come in. "Mom," she used to ask, "how do the waves never stop?" And I would answer, "Because they know who they are. They don't forget their purpose." Maybe that was my problem. Somewhere between motherhood, widowhood, and blind love, I had forgotten who I was. I had become the kind of woman who apologized for existing, who gave everything without expecting honesty in return. But not anymore. As the bus turned toward home, a single sentence repeated in my mind like a promise. She thinks she took everything from me, but she doesn't know what I still have. I didn't yet understand what that envelope contained, whether it held papers, secrets, or just my husband's last words, but I knew it was the beginning of something. A reckoning, perhaps, or a rebirth. By the time I reached my street, the sun was setting over the harbor, staining the sky a bruised gold. The house looked small from the hill, fragile against the wind, and for the first time, I imagined it not as a loss, but as a test I intended to pass. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, my hands trembling but steady enough to tear it open, I whispered, "All right, Thomas. Let's see what you were trying to tell me." The paper crackled softly, and the room filled with the scent of old ink and memory. Something inside me shifted, like the tide beginning to turn. That was the moment my story truly began. And before I go on with what I found inside that envelope, the secret that changed everything, I'd like to ask you, from the bottom of my heart, to subscribe to this channel. It means more than you know. Every new subscriber gives us the strength to keep telling stories like this, stories about love, loss, and the quiet courage of people who refuse to give up. Your support keeps this journey alive. Thank you for being here. Now, before we continue, I want to hear from you. Let's turn this story into a small reflection together. Imagine you were in Eleanor's place, betrayed by someone you love more than life itself. What would you do first? A, call your child immediately and demand an explanation, no matter how painful. B, stay silent and wait to uncover the truth before taking action. Which one would you choose, A or B? Write your answer in the comments below, and let's see how many of you think with your heart and how many think with your instincts. When I got home that evening, the house felt smaller, as if grief itself had shrunk the walls. The air carried the scent of dust and old roses, flowers that had dried weeks ago but still stood in the same vase because I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. I set my purse on the kitchen table and stared at the clock. It ticked the same way it had ticked every day since Thomas died, marking the silence between what was and what would never be again. For a moment, I simply stood there, lost in the stillness, until my eyes drifted toward the narrow hallway that led to my bedroom. I didn't turn on the light. I walked slowly, letting my hand trail along the wall the way Thomas used to when he got up early to make coffee. My chest tightened when I saw his hat hanging by the door, untouched since the morning he left and never came back. The dresser sat by the window, its top covered with framed photographs of our life together, the house by the harbor, our first car, Clara's graduation. And beneath those memories, hidden inside the bottom drawer, lay the envelope. I pulled the drawer open. It was right where I had left it, pale brown paper sealed with a faint strip of glue that had long since dried. My name, written in Thomas's strong, deliberate handwriting, looked as if he had written it yesterday. For the first time in months, I felt my hands shake, not from sorrow but anticipation. I carried the envelope to the bed and sat down, the mattress creaking under my weight. I hesitated before opening it. Grief has a way of making you afraid of the truth, afraid that knowing more will break the fragile balance that keeps you standing. But curiosity, no, love won over fear. The seal came undone easily, as if the letter had been waiting patiently for me to remember. Inside were several folded papers and a single handwritten note. I unfolded it carefully, afraid that one wrong move would make the ink disappear. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side. Forgive me for keeping secrets. I never wanted you to carry the weight of worry that comes with money, decisions, and risk. All I wanted was for you to live in peace, to never lose sleep over the things I could handle quietly. But I couldn't leave this world without making sure you knew the truth, because it belongs to you. With love, Thomas. I placed the letter on the bed and picked up the stack of papers that came with it. The first was a property deed, our harbor house, but beneath it were more, each labeled with addresses I didn't recognize. There were 7 in total: small houses, apartments, a tiny motel by the coast. Another folder contained documents from a company called Grant Holdings, LLC. I frowned. I had never heard of it before. The next pages were bank statements with balances so high they didn't look real. My husband, the man who had worked as a mechanic for 40 years, who always brought home his pay envelope with grease still on his hands, had quietly built an empire. I pressed my palm over the figures, half expecting them to fade like a dream. I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, trying to fit this new reality into the life I thought I knew. I remembered how Thomas used to read the financial section of the newspaper every morning. I had teased him for it. "You planning to buy Wall Street?" I'd laugh, pouring him coffee. He'd only smile and say, "Just keeping an eye on the future." I never realized how literal those words were. Then I found a second note tucked inside a folder, smaller and written in his quick, slanted script. "You must be careful, Ellie. If Clara ever learns how much we have, she'll see us differently. I want her love to stay pure, not clouded by inheritance or greed. Please promise me you'll keep this between us until the time comes when truth is safer than silence." The words struck me hard, a confession wrapped in fear and foresight. I had spent months grieving the man I lost, and here he was, reaching across time to warn me about the daughter I loved. I pressed the letter to my chest and felt a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude. He had known. Somehow, he had sensed what I refused to see. Outside, the wind rattled the window. I looked toward the harbor, where the faint glimmer of lights shimmered across the water. The house across the street had already gone dark. Everything looked calm, but my mind was racing. If these documents were real and I had no reason to doubt they were, then Clara's actions were more than betrayal. They were theft. She hadn't just taken a house or a car. She had tried to strip me of security I didn't even know I had. Yet, beneath the anger was something deeper, quieter. A question that burned. Had I raised her to believe that money was worth more than decency? I folded the letters and placed them neatly on the bed. The papers felt heavy in my hands, heavier than gold. For the first time since Thomas's death, I felt something other than grief. Purpose. I decided to confirm everything before acting. The next morning, I took the earliest bus to the city to see Mr. Lawson, the attorney who had handled Thomas's will. His office hadn't changed, same dusty bookshelf, same framed diplomas yellowed with time. He greeted me with the warmth of an old friend, but that warmth faded as soon as he saw the documents. "Mrs. Grant," he said slowly, scanning the papers. "I had no idea Thomas had built this. He must have been investing quietly for years." He adjusted his glasses, his brows furrowed. "You are, without any doubt, the sole owner of all of this." I stared at him. "So it's real?" "Every line, every number, every property. He put everything in your name, likely to protect you. I can't imagine how he managed this without anyone noticing." "He was always careful," I said softly. "He didn't even buy new shoes without thinking twice." Mr. Lawson gave a half smile. "That's how men like your husband build security, slowly, quietly." Then his face turned serious. "Mrs. Grant, if your daughter sold the harbor house, that sale is invalid. She had no right to do it." The words hung between us like a verdict. I could have demanded action charges, lawsuits, punishment, but my heart refused vengeance. I didn't want Clara destroyed. I wanted her to understand. "No," I said finally. "I don't want her prosecuted. I just want my home back." He studied me for a long moment. "You sound like a woman with a plan." "I don't have one yet," I admitted, "but I will." When I left the office, the morning sun had broken through the clouds. The city was alive, buses hissing, pigeons scattering, people rushing with coffee cups in hand. I walked through it all, feeling both invisible and invincible. I had been a grieving widow when I woke up that morning. By noon, I was something else entirely. Thomas's secret had changed everything, not because it made me rich, but because it gave me back control. He had given me the tools to rebuild not just my life, but my dignity. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, my love. I understand now." The harbor wind carried my words away, but I knew he heard them. That night, when I placed the envelope back in the drawer, I felt the faintest sense of peace. The betrayal that had begun with a phone call no longer defined me. It had awakened me. And tomorrow, I would begin the quiet work of reclaiming what was mine, not through anger, but through patience, through wisdom, and through the kind of strength Thomas always believed I had. The next morning began like any other gray light seeping through the curtains, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the kitchen, but I was no longer the same woman who had gone to bed the night before. The knowledge I carried now hummed beneath my skin like a secret pulse. Thomas's envelope had turned my quiet despair into something sharper, quieter, but infinitely stronger. I had evidence, power, and clarity, and for the first time since he died, I had direction. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue coat and the scarf Thomas had bought me on our 40th anniversary. There was something about wearing it that gave me courage, as if the fabric itself remembered the warmth of his hands. I packed the documents into a folder, slipped it into my handbag, and headed for the bus stop. The air outside was crisp, carrying the briny scent of the harbor. The same town that had watched me bury my husband would now witness me rise from the ruins of my own heartbreak. Mr. Lawson's office was housed in an old brick building downtown, its brass doorplate polished to a dull shine. He greeted me with a polite smile that softened into genuine concern when he saw my expression. "Mrs. Grant," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "You look like someone who has questions that matter." "I do," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. I handed him the folder. "I need you to tell me if these are real. If everything my husband wrote to me is true." He adjusted his glasses and began leafing through the documents. For a long while, the only sound in the room was the whisper of paper and the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he exhaled, a low sound of disbelief. "Thomas Grant," he said softly, almost to himself. That man was far more brilliant than anyone gave him credit for. I leaned forward. "So it's all legitimate?" "Every document, every signature, every account. These are authentic. Mrs. Grant, your husband wasn't just investing, he was protecting you. All of these assets are in your name, not jointly owned, not shared. You are the sole beneficiary and legal owner." His words felt heavy in the air, like a verdict. I sat back in the chair, absorbing their meaning. For months I had lived as if my life were over. Now it was as if I'd been handed the key to a kingdom I didn't know I ruled. Mr. Lawson continued. "If your daughter sold the harbor house without your authorization, that transaction is invalid. Fraudulent, in fact. The buyers will have to return the property. You could also press charges if you wish." I didn't answer right away. The idea of calling the police, of seeing Clara's name attached to a criminal case, twisted something deep in my chest. She was my child, my only one. The thought of punishing her publicly felt unbearable, even after what she'd done. "I don't want to ruin her life," I said finally. "I just want my home back. And perhaps something more valuable than that." Mr. Lawson tilted his head. "Which is?" "Understanding," I said. "I want her to understand what she's done, to feel the loss she inflicted, not through handcuffs or a courtroom, but through her own choices." He regarded me thoughtfully. "You sound like a woman with a plan." "I have an intention," I said quietly. "The plan will come." He nodded, closing the folder. "Then let's begin with the legal basics. I can file the paperwork to invalidate the sale. Once that's done, we'll restore ownership to your name. But if you wish to keep this discreet, we can handle it quietly through private negotiation." "Yes," I said. "No one must know, not even my daughter." He smiled faintly, not with amusement but with respect. "You're remarkably calm about all this." I met his gaze. "When you've lost everything you thought mattered, calm is what's left. And from calm, you rebuild." As I left his office, the streets outside seemed brighter, though the sky was overcast. I walked slowly, taking in the rhythm of the city, the clatter of shop doors, the murmur of pedestrians, the soft hiss of the tide rolling in from the harbor. Every sound reminded me that life continued regardless of heartbreak. Maybe it was time I did too. At the corner cafe, I ordered a cup of tea and sat by the window. For a few minutes, I let myself breathe. I thought of Clara, not the woman who had sold my home, but the little girl who used to run along this very street clutching an ice cream cone, laughing as Thomas chased after her. When had that child vanished? Was it when her father died? Or had the transformation started long before, hidden beneath layers of entitlement I had mistaken for confidence? The memory of her voice on the phone replayed in my head, detached and casual. We needed the money. Those words no longer stung the way they had yesterday. Now they revealed something different, not cruelty, but ignorance. Clara had grown up in a house built on sacrifice she never saw. She had taken comfort for granted because she'd never known fear. Maybe this was Thomas's message all along. Maybe he had known she would need to learn what survival meant the hard way. When I returned home, I opened the window overlooking the harbor. The tide was high, the water restless. I imagined the property deeds and bank statements as waves, each one carrying a part of Thomas's foresight. I whispered a thank you into the wind. I knew he couldn't answer, but I also knew he was the kind of man who planned even for silence. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and began to write. Not a letter, not a diary entry, just thoughts, scattered and raw. What do I want? Justice? Peace? Revenge? The words felt strange on paper, as if they belonged to another woman. I drew a line through revenge. That wasn't what this was about. I didn't want to destroy Clara. I wanted to rebuild her, and maybe, in doing so, rebuild myself. I wrote down everything Mr. Lawson had told me, the steps to recover the property, the options for keeping it secret, the timeline for transfer of ownership. I added one more note in bold. Don't tell her yet. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands trembled so much I spilled some onto the page. The ink bled slightly, blurring the words until they looked like veins running across the paper. It reminded me of Thomas's hands, steady, patient, never hurried. He had always believed in preparation, in letting things unfold at their proper pace. Before I went to bed, I opened the dresser drawer again and looked at the envelope, now empty but still sacred. It was no longer a symbol of loss. It had become a blueprint for survival. Outside, the moon hung low over the harbor, pale and watchful. The reflection on the water looked like a single silver path stretching toward something unknown. I didn't know where it led yet, but I felt Thomas's presence guiding me. The betrayal that had shattered my heart was slowly becoming the spark that would define my strength. I turned off the light, whispering into the dark. Tomorrow, I start taking back my life. And for the first time in months, I believed it. For the first time in years, I woke up with purpose. It wasn't joy. Exactly, it was something quieter, steadier, like the steady hum beneath the ocean before a storm. I had spent my life letting things happen to me, the long years of widowhood creeping into routine, Clara's distance growing like a fog I couldn't clear, and finally, the betrayal that had torn what was left of my peace apart. But now I had something my daughter never expected me to have: knowledge. Knowledge of what was truly mine, and the clarity to use it. Mr. Lawson had given me more than legal advice that day. He had given me back a sense of agency. I had lain awake most of the night replaying his words, "You are the sole owner of everything." Those 7 words were both terrifying and liberating. What would I do with that power? Confront Clara? Drag her into a courtroom? No, that would be too easy and too small. What I wanted couldn't be written in a legal document or delivered by a sheriff at the door. I wanted a lesson, not revenge. I spent the next morning combing through every document Thomas had left behind. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and his cologne, a scent that pulled memories from the corners of my heart. The letters confirmed what Mr. Lawson had told me. I owned not just the harbor house but 6 other properties spread across the city. One of them, I realized with bitter irony, was the very apartment building where Clara and her husband lived. For years, she had believed she was paying rent to a faceless management company. In truth, she had been living under my roof all along. The thought almost made me smile. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was something closer to poetry. Life had a strange sense of humor. That afternoon, I called Mr. Lawson and asked him to handle everything quietly. "I want to reclaim my properties, but I don't want Clara to know I'm behind it," I said. He paused for a moment. "That can be arranged. We'll move through intermediaries. We can file the paperwork under your company, Grant Holdings LLC. It'll take time, but it can be done." "Do it," I said. And once it's finished, I want every asset legally secured under my direct control. The house, the apartments, the accounts, everything." He hesitated again, his tone gentler this time. "You're sure about this? About keeping her in the dark?" "Yes," I said quietly. "If she's ever going to understand what she did, she needs to believe I have nothing." After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the harbor. The sea was restless that day, the waves breaking against the rocks with force. Thomas used to say the ocean reflected whatever lived inside us. "When you're calm, it's calm. When you're angry, it mirrors that too," he'd told me once. If that was true, then the water that day carried my resolve. Over the next few weeks, I lived two lives. To the outside world, I was the same old widow whose daughter had left her behind. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and sympathy. The woman at the market slipped me discounts with pity in her eyes. I accepted their gestures with gratitude and silence. They saw vulnerability. I was cultivating invisibility. But privately, I was someone else entirely. Each evening, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, signing forms, reviewing deeds, and listening to Mr. Lawson's updates. My signature, once used to sign permission slips and grocery receipts, now reshaped the legal map of my life. Slowly, my world began to align with truth again. The harbor house was being reclaimed. The bank had frozen the fraudulent sale. The title was reverting to my name. When Mr. Lawson called one morning to confirm it was official, I closed my eyes and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My house, the place where Thomas and I had built our memories, was mine again. But that was only the beginning. The next step was to ensure that Clara could never repeat what she had done. Through Grant Holdings, I restructured everything: trusts, deeds, management contracts, all under my exclusive authority. I added contingencies that would prevent any transfer or sale without my written approval. Mr. Lawson worked discreetly, hiring clerks who didn't know the full picture, making sure my name appeared only on private documents. "Mrs. Grant," he said one afternoon, "this level of protection would make a banker jealous." "I'm not protecting my money," I told him. "I'm protecting the meaning of it." It was during one of those meetings that I decided on the next part of my plan, a way to reach Clara not through confrontation, but through reflection. I wanted her to see the world without the illusion of safety, to feel the weight of uncertainty I had carried for months. She believed I was helpless. I would let her believe it. But I would also make sure that belief forced her to see who she really was. At night, I walked through the house, touching the furniture Thomas had built: the oak table, the bookshelf with uneven legs, the chair that creaked whenever he sat in it. Every piece reminded me of the patience that had built our life together. He had never rushed through anything. He had trusted in time. That was how I needed to move now, slowly, deliberately, like him. I began keeping a small notebook where I documented every step of my plan. It wasn't just about reclaiming what was stolen, it was about reclaiming my dignity. On the first page, I wrote, "Let her believe she took everything, then show her what she never really had." In the weeks that followed, people continued to speak to me in the hushed tones reserved for the pitied. "You poor thing," my neighbor said one afternoon as I watered the roses. "Clara left you with nothing?" "Almost nothing," I replied with a smile, "but that's enough for now." They had no idea how true that was. The nothingness they saw was my disguise. Beneath it, I was rebuilding an empire, one signature, one silent decision at a time. When I returned inside, the afternoon light spilled through the window, falling across the kitchen floor in golden stripes. It struck me how life could look ordinary while something extraordinary was taking shape beneath it. I made tea, sat at the table, and imagined the moment Clara would return from Europe, expecting a frail mother with an empty life. She would find someone else entirely, a woman who had seen betrayal and chosen wisdom over vengeance. The wind from the harbor picked up, rattling the windows as if Thomas himself were reminding me not to waver. I closed my eyes and whispered into the air, "I'm doing it your way, quietly, carefully." That night, as I folded the final legal documents into a neat pile, I realized that grief and betrayal had given me something I hadn't known: I was missing clarity. The kind that only arrives when everything comfortable is stripped away. I wasn't the powerless widow my daughter thought I was. I was Eleanor Grant, and I was done being invisible. 3 weeks passed in an almost eerie stillness. On the surface, life carried its same rhythm. The neighbors waved from their porches, the mail arrived on schedule, and the sea kept rolling against the harbor wall as if nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had. Each morning, I woke with the awareness that the world was finally tilting in my favor, even if no one could see it. The harbor house was mine again, the legal transfers were done, and the rest of my properties were quietly being secured under my name. Mr. Lawson had been efficient and discreet, just as I'd asked. I played my part as the quiet widow who had lost everything, when in truth I was rebuilding from the shadows, stone by stone, like a woman laying the foundation of her own rebirth. But silence has a strange way of preparing you for noise. It was a Sunday afternoon when the first crack appeared in the quiet facade of my days. My neighbor, Mrs. Hale, came rushing across the street with her apron still dusted in flour. She had that look of someone who had tasted gossip too good to keep. "Eleanor," she said, breathless, "have you heard about your daughter's husband? They say Martin's in trouble with the bank. Big trouble." I looked up from my rose bushes. "Trouble?" She nodded, lowering her voice as though the waves themselves might be listening. "Apparently, he took out some kind of loan using their apartment as collateral, but the papers didn't check out. There's talk of forgery, the bank's investigating, and people are saying he's skipped the country." For a long moment, I didn't respond. I just stood there, pruning shears in hand, the afternoon sun glinting off the metal blades. So, it had begun. The world was catching up with Martin. Mrs. Hale mistook my silence for shock. "I'm so sorry, dear. I know Clara's your only family left. I can't imagine what she must be going through." Neither could I. Not yet. But I had a feeling I would soon find out. That evening, I sat by the window, looking out over the dark water. The harbor lights shimmered on the surface like restless stars. I thought of Clara, her voice on the phone, so confident, so sure of herself. I had wondered what would bring her back to me. Now I knew. It wouldn't be guilt or love or sudden realization. It would be necessity. She would come home because she had nowhere else left to go. And when she did, she would find not the helpless mother she imagined, but the woman her father had trusted to carry out his final plan. 2 days later, I didn't need to imagine anymore. The phone rang in the late afternoon, its sound slicing through the quiet house. I almost let it ring out, but something inside me, the part that still ached to hear my daughter's voice, made me answer. "Mom?" The voice was small, brittle, and stripped of all the confidence I remembered. "Clara," I said, my tone deliberately calm. "Where are you calling from?" "The airport." "I just got back. Martin, he stayed behind. There's been a misunderstanding with the banks. It's a nightmare. I don't know what to do." I could almost hear her trying to catch her breath on the other end. The weight of her own choices was finally pressing down. "I see," I said softly. "Are you alone?" "Yes." A pause, then her voice cracked. "Mom, can I stay with you for a few days? Just until I figure things out?" I let the silence stretch, not to punish her but to remind myself that this was the moment everything had been leading toward. I could feel the ache in my chest, the instinct to say yes immediately, to take her pain as my own, but I held it back. The lesson had to unfold naturally. "Of course, Clara," I said finally. "You're always welcome here." When she arrived, I almost didn't recognize her. Her skin looked pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. The expensive clothes she had once worn like armor now seemed too large for her. She stood at the door holding 2 suitcases, and for a second, she looked like a lost child rather than a grown woman who had once told her mother, "We needed the money." I opened the door wide. "Come in," I said gently. "Thank you, Mom." Her voice trembled. She stepped inside, and for a brief, fragile moment, I saw the girl she used to be, the one who had run to me after nightmares, who had clung to my hand in crowds. But then I remembered the woman who had hung up on me without a goodbye, and the warmth in my chest cooled into resolve. She sat at the kitchen table, running her fingers along its worn edge. "It's strange," she murmured. "This house feels smaller than I remember." "That happens when you leave for too long," I replied. "The rooms forget your footsteps." She smiled weakly, And then, as if she couldn't hold it in any longer, the words tumbled out. "Martin's gone, Mom. He left. There was never a real business in Europe. He lied about everything. He's drowning in debt, and the bank's coming after me because my name was on some of the papers. I didn't even know. I swear I didn't." I said nothing, only nodded, letting her fill the silence. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "I thought maybe I could stay here just until I find a job." There it was, the moment I had imagined on so many sleepless nights. The same daughter who had discarded me as if I were an inconvenience now sat in front of me, broken, asking for shelter. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt something far heavier: sorrow. Because love, no matter how wounded, never truly dies. It just learns to stand guard over itself. "Of course you can stay," I said softly. "This is your home." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "After everything I did?" "Especially after that," I said. "You're my daughter. That doesn't change." She burst into tears then. Real tears, not the kind she used to shed to win an argument or earn sympathy. These were tears of surrender. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold and trembling. As she cried, I looked at her face and realized something extraordinary. This wasn't just the consequence of her actions, it was the beginning of her awakening. The kind of awakening that only comes when everything else has fallen apart. Later that night, after she had gone to bed in her old room, I sat in the quiet kitchen again. The moonlight spilled across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of salt. I thought about what had just happened and what was still to come. I had given her a place to rest, but not a refuge from truth. Not yet. She believed she was here because of misfortune. Soon she would learn she was here to confront the kind of lesson that only life or a patient mother can teach. I would let her rest for a while, let her believe she was safe. Then, when the time was right, I would show her the cost of what she had done, not through anger, but through wisdom. I poured myself a cup of tea, the same way I used to when Thomas and I planned our future. I raised the cup slightly, as if toasting the empty chair across from me. "You were right," I whispered. "The time has come." The tea was still warm when I smiled to myself, a smile both tender and unflinching. My daughter had returned home, but this time I would be the one writing the rules. The days that followed her return unfolded with an almost unbearable quiet. Clara slept late, her exhaustion heavy and visible in every movement. The once confident woman who had spoken in clipped tones and perfect posture now moved as though her bones carried the weight of her own choices. I didn't press her for details. I didn't ask how much money was gone, or how deep Martin's deceptions ran. I knew enough from Mr. Lawson's discreet updates to understand that everything around her had collapsed, their accounts frozen, her name tied to fraudulent documents, and her husband's trail lost somewhere in Europe. The banks had begun proceedings, but since her signature had been forged, she would likely escape the worst of it. Still, it was a humiliation no courtroom could undo. For the first time in years, she cooked breakfast with me, though she barely ate. I watched her hands, once manicured, now trembling as she poured coffee. She didn't notice that I set my cup down untouched. I was studying her in silence, the way one studies the weather, knowing a storm is near but uncertain whether it will destroy or cleanse. One evening, while sorting through the mail, she found something unexpected, a small envelope tucked among the bills. It was old, yellowed at the edges, and addressed to me in Thomas's familiar handwriting. I froze when I saw it. I had thought I'd discovered all his letters. This one must have slipped between the pages of an old file. Clara turned it over in her hands, reading the words aloud. "To my wife, if found after my passing." She looked at me uncertainly. "Do you want me to open it, Mom?" I hesitated. The air in the room felt suddenly heavier. "Go ahead," I said finally. Her fingers tore carefully along the fold. Inside was a small note and a safe deposit key taped to the paper. The note read, "If Clara ever loses her way, this will help her find her strength again. Box 214, Harbor Bank, T." She read it twice, her eyes glistening. "He mentioned me?" I nodded, though my throat tightened. "He always believed in you," I said softly, "even when he feared you might forget who you are." The next morning, we went together to the bank. The manager, a gray-haired man who had known Thomas well, escorted us into a private room. When he opened the safe deposit box, the smell of metal and time filled the air. Inside lay a velvet pouch and another sealed envelope. Clara lifted the pouch first and untied the string. Out spilled the glimmer of gold and diamond jewelry, necklaces, rings, brooches, pieces I had never seen before. The second envelope held a simple message from Thomas, for emergencies or redemption, whichever comes first. Clara stared at the jewels as though seeing something sacred. "He left these for me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We could sell them, Mom. I could pay off some of the debts, start again. Maybe this is what he meant." I watched her fingers trace the jewels, her reflection shimmering faintly in the polished gold. For a moment, I saw the child she once was, the one who used to sneak into my room to try on my earrings, giggling at her own reflection. Now she looked at the jewels not with vanity but with desperation. "If you think it's right, then do it," I said. Her head snapped up in surprise. "You'd let me?" "Yes, but remember what your father wrote, emergencies or redemption. Only you can decide which this is." She didn't answer. Instead, she gathered the jewelry carefully and left for the appraiser's office that same afternoon. When she returned hours later, she looked drained but lighter. "They gave me a fair price," she said quietly. "It's enough to cover part of the damage. I still have to find work to manage the rest." I nodded. "Then that's what you'll do." In the following days, Clara began leaving early in the morning and coming home long after sunset. She had found a temporary job cleaning offices at night. It was not glamorous, but it was honest. I never questioned her about it. I simply left a plate of food on the table and let her eat in silence when she returned. Sometimes, I would wake in the middle of the night and hear her moving around the kitchen, washing dishes, humming softly under her breath. It wasn't the tune of someone content, but of someone learning how to breathe again. There was a quiet dignity in it, and though she didn't know it, I would stand in the hallway and watch her from the shadows, the way mothers do when they're proud but afraid to say it too soon. One evening, she sat down across from me, her uniform still smelling faintly of disinfectant and rain. "Mom," she said, "today I met a woman who cleans with me. She's 72 and still working double shifts because her son lost their savings. She told me she prays for strength every morning, not money. I used to think people like that were weak, but now I think they're stronger than anyone I've ever met." Her eyes searched mine, vulnerable but bright. "Is that what you felt all these years? When Dad died? When I left?" I reached for her hand, calloused now, lined with small cuts from her work. "Yes," I said. "Strength doesn't come from having everything. It comes from surviving without it." She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. It was the first real conversation we had shared in years, the kind built not from guilt or pretense, but from understanding. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, Thomas's letter still open beside me. The words emergencies or redemption glowed in the lamplight like a whisper from the past. I realized then that this had never been about the jewelry or the money. It was about timing. Thomas had known that redemption would only mean something if it was earned, not given. Over the next week, I made a quiet decision. I called Mr. Lawson and asked him to proceed with clearing Clara's name from the fraudulent documents Martin had forged. "Do it anonymously," I told him. "She doesn't need to know who helped." He paused. "You're certain?" "Yes. This isn't about rewarding her, it's about freeing her to stand on her own." By the end of that month, Clara's debts were officially settled. The banks withdrew their claims, and the investigation shifted entirely toward Martin, whose location was still unknown. Clara didn't celebrate when she heard the news. She only nodded quietly and said, "Maybe I can finally breathe." I didn't tell her that her freedom had come from me. Some truths need to wait for their own time, and this one was still ripening. Every night, as she came home and washed her hands under the warm kitchen light, I saw the woman she was becoming, a woman I had hoped she would one day be. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something steadier, humbler. In the reflection of the window, her eyes no longer looked restless, they looked awake. And though I said nothing, I whispered a prayer of thanks to the man who had seen this moment long before I could. "You were right, Thomas," I murmured. "She's finding her way. And maybe, just maybe, so am I." The nights in late spring carried a kind of fragile stillness, the sort that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The sound of Clara's footsteps had become part of the rhythm of the house, soft creaks in the hallway when she returned from her night job, the gentle closing of her bedroom door, the muffled hum of exhaustion in her voice each morning. She was changing, though neither of us dared to say it aloud. There was a humility in the way she moved now, a gentleness that had been absent for years. The woman who once demanded, expected, and took without question was learning how to ask, how to wait, and how to carry her own weight. I watched this transformation quietly, letting time do its slow work. Some lessons can't be taught through words, they have to be lived until they etch themselves into your bones. Clara had reached that point, the kind of maturity that only comes when life itself becomes the teacher. And yet, as I watched her rediscover her strength, I couldn't ignore the shadow of guilt that lingered in her eyes. Every smile she gave me carried a question beneath it, a silent plea for forgiveness she couldn't yet voice. I wanted to tell her she already had it, but the words stayed behind my teeth. Forgiveness isn't a gift. It's a seed. It needs time, warmth, and a bit of struggle before it grows. It was a gray morning when the phone rang. I was in the garden trimming the hydrangeas, my hands dirty, my heart calm. Mr. Lawson's voice on the other end broke the quiet. "Mrs. Grant, I thought you'd want to know. The bank has cleared all charges against your daughter. The forged documents have been traced entirely to her husband. She's in the clear." "Thank you," I said softly. "There's something else," he added. "Martin's been located in France, arrested for fraud and identity theft. Extradition papers are being filed. He won't be bothering anyone for a long time." When I hung up, I felt no satisfaction, only a weary kind of peace. Justice had come, not because I demanded it, but because it had simply arrived on its own, as it often does when truth is patient enough to wait. That evening, I told Clara the news over dinner. She froze, her fork midair. "He's been arrested?" "Yes." She set the fork down slowly. "I thought I'd feel relief," she said after a pause, "but all I feel is empty. I spent years building a life with someone who never existed." "You built it," I corrected gently. "He just occupied the space in it." Her eyes filled with tears. "You should hate me for everything I did." "I did," I said quietly. "For a while. Then I realized hate was too heavy to carry, especially for someone I love." She covered her face with her hands. "I don't deserve you, Mom." "No one ever really deserves love," I said. "It's not a transaction. It's a choice." That night, after she went to bed, I stood at her door for a long time. She was sleeping on her side, the same way she had as a child, her hands curled under her chin. The light from the hallway fell across her face, and I saw traces of both the woman she had become and the little girl who once believed I could fix everything. I closed the door quietly and went to my room, where the old notebook lay open on the nightstand. In it, I'd been recording the steps of this strange journey, the reclamation of my home, the return of my daughter, the rediscovery of my own voice. That night, I wrote one more line. "She is beginning to understand that work can heal what money destroys." The following weeks were slow, peaceful. Clara continued working, though the debts had been lifted. She insisted on paying rent, a small amount she tucked into an envelope and left on the kitchen counter every Friday. I never touched it, but I never told her that either. I understood what she was doing. This was her way of reclaiming dignity. Every dollar she earned with her own hands carried meaning. One evening, she came home with a stack of brochures from the local community college. "I've been thinking," she said, setting them on the table. "I want to study again, maybe something in counseling or social work. There are people who go through what I did, women who lose everything because they trusted the wrong person. I want to help them." I looked at her, this woman who once defined herself by what she owned, now speaking about helping others rebuild. "Your father would be proud," I said softly. She smiled faintly. "Do you think so?" "I know so." The days grew longer as summer arrived. Clara began volunteering at the church's outreach center during her free hours, helping women fill out job applications, guiding them through paperwork. Each evening she came home smelling of detergent and rain, her uniform damp, her eyes bright with purpose. One night, she came into the kitchen while I was making tea. "Mom," she said, "I met someone today, a woman named June. She's 67 and raising her granddaughter alone after her daughter disappeared. She said she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I used my pay from last week to buy her groceries." I looked at her hands, red from the cold, trembling slightly from fatigue. "You did the right thing," I said. "She cried when I gave them to her," Clara whispered. "I think that moment changed me. I don't need to chase anything anymore. I just want to be someone who gives instead of takes." That night, after she went to bed, I sat on the porch, the moonlight rippling over the harbor. The water was calm, silver, endless. I thought of Thomas and his letters, of the way he'd seen further into our lives than I ever could. He had predicted this, not just the betrayal or the loss, but the transformation that could grow from it if I stayed steady. The words from his note echoed in my mind. If she ever loses her way, this will help her find her strength again. He had been right. Clara's strength wasn't in her wealth or charm or ambition. It was in her capacity to fall, break, and rebuild. Watching her now, I realized that the lesson I thought I had been teaching her was teaching me in return. I had believed this was about reclaiming my power, but in truth, it was about rediscovering love, stripped of pride. The next morning I found her sitting at the kitchen table, writing something in her own notebook. "What are you working on?" I asked. "A plan," she said, smiling. "For a new start. Maybe a scholarship for women like June. Maybe a small fund. I don't know yet." I poured us both coffee and sat down beside her. "Whatever it is," I said, "you won't be doing it alone." She looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise and quiet gratitude. "You really mean that?" "I do. But remember, Clara helping others doesn't erase the past. It transforms it." She nodded slowly. "Then, that's what I'll do." As she spoke, I realized that the fragile silence of our house had shifted. It no longer felt empty. It felt alive. The rhythm of her footsteps, once a reminder of absence, now sounded like hope moving through the halls. And for the first time since the day my phone rang with her careless words, I allowed myself to breathe without pain. The story that began with betrayal was beginning to turn toward something else, something that felt a lot like grace. The air that summer carried a quiet sweetness, the kind that comes when life, after too much noise, finally learns how to whisper again. The world around us seemed unchanged, the same cobblestone streets, the same rhythm of the sea, but inside our small home, everything felt new. Clara and I had fallen into an unspoken harmony. We shared breakfasts in silence that was no longer heavy. We folded laundry side by side without tension, and sometimes, when the evening light softened through the curtains, she would hum the same songs her father used to sing while fixing the truck. There was peace in the ordinary, a peace I had once thought impossible. But peace, I had learned, does not arrive as a gift. It is built, slowly, through forgiveness that you practice even when your heart resists. Clara's transformation was steady but visible. She worked long hours at the community center now, a job she had secured through her volunteer work. Her title was Modest Assistant Coordinator, but the pride in her voice when she spoke of it made it sound grander than anything she'd ever had before. Every evening she came home with stories about the women she helped: single mothers starting over, elderly widows fighting eviction, young girls learning to stand on their own. She spoke their names with tenderness, and in every one of them, I recognized a reflection of the woman she used to be, the one who had to fall before she could rise. One evening, she came home later than usual. Her eyes were tired, her hands red from carrying boxes, but her smile was soft and certain. "Mom," she said, dropping her bag on the chair, "you remember June, the grandmother I told you about?" "Yes, the one raising her granddaughter. She found a job at the bakery, full-time. I helped her prepare her resume and talk to the manager. She starts Monday." Clara's voice trembled with quiet pride. She cried when she told me. She said she didn't think anyone would ever believe in her again. I smiled. "And you did." "I just gave her what you gave me," she said. Those words, simple as they were, settled into the air like a blessing. Weeks turned into months. Clara's work became her anchor, and I noticed she carried herself differently now, shoulders back, gaze clear, no longer weighed down by guilt or uncertainty. She was becoming a woman her father would have admired, not for her success, but for her strength. I sometimes caught her standing by the window at night, looking at the stars in silence. I never interrupted her. I knew who she was speaking to. Then, one Saturday morning, she appeared at my bedroom door holding a stack of papers. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked. "Of course." She sat on the edge of the bed and handed me the papers. "It's an application. I want to go back to school to get my degree in social work. I've been thinking about it for months." I read the form slowly, tracing the lines where she had already filled in her information in careful, deliberate handwriting. "That's a wonderful idea, Clara. You'd be perfect for it." "I can't afford it yet," she said, "but I'm saving. The center might offer me a small scholarship. It'll take time, but I'll make it happen." I placed my hand over hers. "You don't have to do it alone." "I know," she said softly, "but I need to. This is something I have to build myself. Not out of guilt this time, but out of purpose." I understood. The daughter who once believed money could solve anything now wanted to earn her way to meaning, and that, I realized, was worth more than any inheritance. Autumn came early that year. The mornings were crisp, the light thin and golden. Clara's acceptance letter arrived one chilly morning, folded neatly in an ivory envelope. She stood at the kitchen counter holding it, her eyes wide, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and joy. "I got in," she whispered. "Mom, I actually got in." I hugged her, the way I used to when she was little, when her entire world could be fixed with a mother's embrace. But this time, the embrace was different. It wasn't protection. It was pride. That night we sat by the fire, sipping tea, the letter resting on the table between us. "Do you remember the day I called you from the airport?" she asked suddenly. Every muscle in me stiffened, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think about that day all the time, about how cruel I sounded, about how sure I was that I was doing the right thing." She stared into the flames, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how you forgave me." I looked at her, the flickering light softening her features. "Because one day, I might have needed the same kind of forgiveness," I said. "Life is long, Clara. We all make choices that break someone's heart, sometimes even our own. The only thing that matters is whether we learn from them." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I've learned, Mom. I really have." The room fell into a quiet rhythm of crackling fire and unspoken gratitude. For the first time, I felt no distance between us, no unhealed wound, no hidden resentment. Just two women who had both survived their own storms and somehow found their way back to the same shore. A few days later, I invited our neighbor, Mrs. Hale, for tea. She had been my confidant through all of this, though she never knew the full story. When I told her Clara had been accepted to the university, her eyes filled with tears. "You must be so proud," she said. "I am," I replied, "but not because she's going back to school. I'm proud because she finally knows who she is." Mrs. Hale stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Do you think she'll ever know everything you did for her?" "Maybe one day," I said, "but by then it won't matter. The best kind of love doesn't need credit, it just needs results." That evening, Clara returned home late, carrying a small notebook. She handed it to me, smiling shyly. "I've been writing something," she said, "for the foundation." I opened it. Inside were pages filled with neat handwriting plans for workshops, support programs, and funding ideas for women escaping abusive relationships. At the bottom of the first page, in bold letters, she had written, "The Eleanor Grant Foundation for Women's Renewal." I stared at the name, my name, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. "You named it after me?" "You taught me everything I know," she said. "This foundation isn't about saving people, it's about helping them find their strength, the same way you helped me." I couldn't speak for a long moment. Finally, I reached across the table and took her hand. "Your father would be proud," I said again, my voice breaking. "No," she said softly, "he'd be proud of both of us." As the night deepened, I realized something I hadn't before. Redemption doesn't arrive in a single act. It builds quietly, moment by moment, in every decision to love, to forgive, and to keep going. Clara's journey had begun with betrayal, but it had led her here to purpose, to compassion, to peace. And in watching her heal, I had found my own kind of healing too. The silence that used to feel like grief now sounded like grace. Winter came gently that year, as though the world itself wanted to tread softly around our newly mended lives. The mornings carried a silver light that slipped through the curtains and fell across the kitchen table where Clara often studied before work, her textbooks spread open beside a cup of coffee gone cold. The foundation had grown from a sketch in her notebook into something tangible, something living. She named it the Eleanor Grant Foundation for Women's Renewal, and though I protested at first, she refused to change it. "Mom," she said, "you're the reason any of this exists. This isn't about me honoring you. It's about truth." The foundation started small. A borrowed room at the community center, a handful of volunteers, boxes of secondhand clothes and shelves of donated books. But soon, people came, women who had been left behind, women who had lost their homes, women who needed someone to remind them that they still had value. Clara spoke to them not as a savior but as an equal. She told them, "I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to wake up and not recognize your own life." Her honesty drew them in. Her humility made them stay. I often watched her quietly during those sessions. Sometimes she didn't see me standing by the door. I saw her listening, nodding, holding a trembling hand or wiping a tear with the tenderness of someone who had learned empathy through pain. There was a calm authority in her now, a steadiness that came not from pride but from purpose. She had rebuilt herself, brick by brick, not with wealth or comfort but with compassion. At home, she began to laugh again. The laughter was quieter than before, less about amusement, more about peace. We had dinners on the porch overlooking the harbor, just as Thomas and I once had. Sometimes she would tell me about a woman she helped find work, or a family the foundation managed to house for the winter. I listened, grateful, though my heart carried a soft ache that comes from witnessing redemption up close. One night, Clara returned home holding an envelope. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "It's from France," she said, placing it on the table. I felt my breath catch before she even opened it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. "It's from him." She broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed slightly from travel. She read silently for a moment before handing it to me. The letter was from Martin. He wrote from a prison near Lyon, where he was serving his sentence for fraud and forgery. The words were simple, no manipulation, no excuses, just a confession and a plea for forgiveness. "I destroyed everything," he wrote, "but I've spent months thinking about what I took from you. I hope one day you'll understand that losing you was the punishment I deserved. You were the only honest thing in my life." I looked up at Clara. She was calm. "What will you do?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm not angry anymore. I don't feel anything. He's already living the consequences of his choices. I don't need to add to them." It was strange, that moment. There was no triumph in her voice, no vindication, only release. It was as though she had set down a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten how heavy it was. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, saying quietly, "That part of my life is over." Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I stood by that same drawer and thought about forgiveness. We often imagine it as a door we open for others, but in truth, it's the one we unlock for ourselves. Watching Clara that evening, I realized she had finally stepped through hers. Months passed, and life found its rhythm again. Clara thrived at the foundation and continued her studies. Her professors spoke highly of her. The women she helped began returning as volunteers, forming a network that spread beyond our little town. The foundation grew faster than either of us had imagined. And though it bore my name, I knew it was her heart that kept it alive. On her graduation day, I sat in the front row of the small auditorium, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Clara walked across the stage in her navy gown, the tassel swaying against her shoulder. When the dean called her name, Clara Grant Masters in Social Work. She looked toward me and smiled, the same radiant, wide-eyed smile she had as a child when she'd mastered her first bicycle ride. The applause around us blurred into a single sound, the sound of fulfillment. After the ceremony, she found me outside under the old oak tree. "You made this possible," she said, pressing a bouquet of white lilies into my hands. I shook my head. "No, Clara, you did. I only gave you time." She laughed softly. "You gave me something else, too. You gave me the truth when it hurt most." As we stood there, the wind carrying the scent of spring, I thought about how far we'd come from that phone call in the doctor's office to this moment of grace. Life, I realized, has a strange symmetry. It breaks you in the exact places where you need to grow stronger. A few weeks later, Clara proposed something new. "Mom," she said one evening, "I've been thinking about the old beach house." My heart tightened at the mention of it, the place where Thomas and I had built so many memories. "What about it?" I asked. "I want to turn it into a refuge, a temporary shelter for women starting over, somewhere they can rest while they rebuild. We can use the foundation's resources to maintain it. I'll oversee the program." I looked at her for a long time, the pride swelling quietly inside me. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "That house gave us so many beginnings. Maybe it can give others the same." That weekend, we drove to the coast. The house stood exactly as we'd left it, white shutters, the porch facing the sea, the garden still wild but alive. As we stepped inside, Clara paused at the doorway, breathing deeply. "I used to think this place belonged to my childhood," she said. "Now I think it belongs to the future." We spent the day cleaning, scrubbing windows, airing out rooms. It felt less like work and more like a ritual, a reconsecration of memory. When the sun began to set, we sat together on the porch. The sea shimmered gold, and the sky stretched open like a promise. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" she asked quietly. I smiled, feeling the warmth of his presence in the wind that brushed against our faces. "He already is," I said. In that stillness, I understood that the story wasn't about loss anymore, it was about legacy. Clara had turned pain into purpose, and I had learned that letting go was another form of love. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, was now a home again, not just for us, but for every woman who would walk through its doors and rediscover her worth. As we drove back that night, the stars lit the sky above the water, and I whispered into the quiet, "We did it, Thomas. She's home." Spring arrived with the scent of renewal. The sea near the beach house shimmered under soft sunlight, and the air carried that rare feeling of peace earned through pain. Clara and I stood outside the front porch, the same porch Thomas had built with his own hands decades ago, watching the new sign being placed above the door, "Haven House, a place to begin again." Below it, in smaller letters, read, "A program of the Eleanor Grant Foundation." Seeing it there, carved into the wood, felt like the closing of a long circle and the beginning of another. The shelter had been open for only a few weeks, but already its rooms were filled with laughter, quiet tears, and the kind of courage that only comes from survival. Each woman who arrived carried a story behind her eyes, abandonment, loss, betrayal, but also a fragile determination to start anew. Clara worked tirelessly alongside the volunteers, helping with paperwork, finding jobs for the residents, and making sure the pantry was always stocked. I often joined her in the evenings, preparing dinner for the group. We'd sit around the long wooden table where Thomas and I once shared family meals, now surrounded by women and children rediscovering what safety felt like. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Clara and I stayed behind in the kitchen. The only light came from a small lamp on the counter. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted but glowing. "Mom," she said, "do you ever think about how different everything could have been if that phone call never happened?" I looked at her, remembering that day as if it were carved into the marrow of my bones, the doctor's office, her cold voice on the phone, the words that broke me. "Every day," I said softly. "But then I realize, if it hadn't happened, you wouldn't be here, doing this. Maybe we both needed to fall apart to find who we really are." Clara nodded. "I used to think love meant protecting someone from pain. Now I think it means walking beside them through it." I reached across the table and took her hand. You've learned what took me a lifetime to understand." The following months unfolded with a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Clara balanced her work at the foundation with her studies, while I managed the day-to-day operations of Haven House. Every morning the smell of coffee mingled with the sea breeze, and the halls filled with the soft chaos of children's footsteps. The house that had once witnessed silence and betrayal now echoed with laughter and hope. Sometimes, when I walked through it alone, I could almost hear Thomas's voice in the wind, saying, "You did it, Eleanor. You both did." One afternoon, while sorting mail at the reception desk, I found a thick envelope addressed to me. The return stamp read, "Ministry of Justice, France." My heart trembled. Inside was a formal notice. Martin had been released after serving his sentence. There was also a short, handwritten note from him, apologetic, remorseful, asking for nothing. I read it twice, then folded it back carefully. I didn't show it to Clara. Some wounds, I decided, heal best without reopening. Instead, I walked to the beach, sat in the sand, and let the tide take my fear away. The man who had caused so much harm no longer held any power here. Clara came home that evening, her face glowing from the ocean wind. "The university invited me to give a talk," she said. "They want me to share how the foundation started. I don't know if I can do it, Mom. I'm not good with speeches." "You don't need to perform," I said. "Just tell the truth. People always listen to truth." The night of her speech, I sat among the audience in a small auditorium filled with students and professors. When Clara stepped onto the stage, she wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry except for her father's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. Her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied, as she told her story not as a tale of failure, but of transformation. "I once thought my worth depended on what I owned," she said. "Then I lost everything, and in that loss, I found something greater perspective, empathy, purpose. My mother taught me that strength isn't loud or showy. It's the quiet decision to get up again when life tries to break you." The audience sat in silence as she finished. Then, one by one, people began to applaud. I clapped too, tears blurring my vision. That moment felt like a benediction, a redemption neither of us could have imagined. Months passed, and Haven House continued to grow. Donations arrived from unexpected places, and local businesses began sponsoring meals. On the house's one-year anniversary, we hosted a gathering. Women who had once arrived broken returned now to volunteer. One of them, June, the grandmother Clara had helped long ago, brought her granddaughter, now smiling and healthy. She hugged Clara tightly and whispered, "You saved us." After everyone left, the house was quiet again. The sun had set, and the waves crashed gently beyond the windows. Clara stood beside me, looking at the photos that lined the walls, families who had passed through our doors, faces marked with resilience. "This is what Dad meant, isn't it?" she said. "That real love keeps working even after you're gone." I nodded. He believed in building things that lasted, and so do you. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the porch, wrapped in a shawl, the sea murmuring softly in the distance. The stars shone bright, scattered like small truths across the sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by what had been lost. I felt anchored by what had been found. I spoke quietly into the night, as if Thomas could still hear me. "She's everything you hoped she'd become," I said. "And I finally understand that my job wasn't to protect her from life, it was to prepare her for it." The next morning, Clara found me on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. "You look peaceful," she said. "I am," I replied, "for the first time in a very long while." She sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Thank you for never giving up on me." I smiled. "Thank you for coming home." The waves rolled against the shore, endless and forgiving, and in that moment, I knew our story had come full circle, not in perfection, but in grace. What began with betrayal had ended with healing, and somewhere between those two edges, we had both become whole. As I looked at my daughter, the woman she had fought to become, I realized something Thomas had always tried to teach me, that justice doesn't always arrive in the form of punishment. Sometimes, it arrives quietly in forgiveness, in wisdom, in the peace that comes from knowing you survived without bitterness. When the sun rose high above the sea, Clara whispered, "Do you think there's ever truly an ending?" "No," I said. "Only new beginnings disguised as peace." And as we sat there side by side, watching the light spill across the ocean, I understood that love tested, broken, and reborn was the truest kind of wealth we would ever possess. In the end, Eleanor and Clara's story was never truly about wealth, betrayal, or even forgiveness. It was about rediscovery. It began with loss, the loss of trust, of dignity, of love's gentler form. Yet through that loss came awakening. Eleanor learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly through endurance, through patience, through the courage to remain kind in a world that tried to make her hard. Clara, in turn, learned that redemption is never found in comfort or denial. It's found in the quiet, relentless work of becoming better than the person you once were. Together, mother and daughter rebuilt something far more valuable than a home or a fortune. They rebuilt faith in themselves, in each other, and in the idea that even the most shattered bonds can heal when love is given space to breathe again. Time had been their greatest teacher. It taught Eleanor that letting go was not surrender but liberation. It taught Clara that humility, compassion, and service could transform shame into purpose. And it taught both of them that every ending can carry the seed of a beginning, if we dare to plant it with grace. The mansion, the money, even the betrayal, all of it had been tools in a larger design that guided them toward a deeper kind of wealth, peace of mind, integrity, and understanding. Their journey reminds us that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it gives it meaning. When Eleanor chose to forgive her daughter, she wasn't excusing the past, she was choosing freedom. And when Clara turned her guilt into service, she wasn't seeking approval, she was choosing redemption. The true miracle wasn't that life gave them a second chance, it was that they were brave enough to take it. For those listening today, perhaps the lesson is this: life will test you through the people you love most. Sometimes it will break you in ways you never saw coming. But those cracks are not signs of weakness, they are openings for light to enter. What matters isn't how much we lose, but how much wisdom we gain through the losing. So if you find yourself standing in the ashes of disappointment or betrayal, remember Eleanor's quiet resilience and Clara's courage to rebuild. Don't let bitterness steal your future. Let compassion lead you forward. There's always a way back to peace if you choose growth over resentment and truth over pride. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe that forgiveness truly frees the one who gives it, or does it only ease the one who receives it? Share your answer, A for it frees the giver, or B for it helps both equally in the comments below so others can see your thoughts and reflect as well. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful stories that remind us all it's never too late to start again and never too late to heal.